Before you listen, I should let you know, this episode contains sound from violent incidents.
911, what's location of the emergency? Great, thank you. Hi, what's going on there?
Yeah, it's guys going down the street breaking windows of cars. He busted both my truck windows out.
This story starts on a Sunday night, a little after 9 o'clock on March 18th, 2018. A man calls the police to report suspicious activity in his Sacramento neighborhood.
Hey, but he's in people's backyard right now, across the street from my place.
The caller tells the dispatcher the guy is hiding in his neighbor's backyard.
Okay.
Cornered in people's backyard right now.
Do you know which yard he's in, what the address is?
Oh, I can't see the address on the house. The lights are off.
Attention Sector 5 units, pending 981. The male in a black hoodie or complainant.
Two officers drive over to check things out. A nearby sheriff's helicopter hears the call and flies over. On the ground, officers speak with neighbors.
Perfect. Do you mind just staying in the house, or can you stay in the house, please?
From overhead, a deputy in the helicopter surveys the backyards. He sees the suspect approach the back door to one of the houses.
Just broke the window, running south, running to the south.
Less than a minute later,
Show me your hands, gun! Show me your hands, gun! 5-7, shots fired, 7-8 down. Show me your hands! Let's see your hands!
Stephon Clark dies from the gunshots. The two officers who follow him into that backyard shoot 20 times. At least 7 of the bullets hit him.
You all right? You hit? Yeah, I'm good. All right.
Stephon Clark was 22 years old. He carried no weapons. The backyard he ran into belonged to his grandparents. He was staying with them. Usually he entered their house through the back door. Almost a year later, Clark's fiancée, Selena Mani, faced the press inside a small church in Sacramento. Her body heaved with anger and grief.
Today, the DA announced that the officers who shot my unarmed fiancé won't face any charges. Continuing the shameful legacy of officers killing black men without consequences. And breaking my family's hearts again.
Earlier, on the day of this press conference, the district attorney went public with intimate details about alleged domestic violence that Selena had thought would stay private. Her anguish for herself and her 2 young sons sounded raw.
My boys, Aiden and Cairo, have to grow up without their father. And I have to continue on as a single parent without Stephon.
Stephon Clark was one of 115 Californians and 998 Americans police shot dead in 2018. In some ways, his case tells a familiar story. Police kill black men in ways that strike many people as unjust. These shootings set off massive street protests. But throughout the country, juries and prosecutors often determine that officers acted legally when they opened fire.
In the last few minutes, jurors found Yanez not guilty in the shooting death last July of Philando Castile.
No probable cause exists to file any charge against Officer Wilson.
Declined to bring charges against a white police officer
in connection with the death of a black civilian.
In the death of an unarmed black man.
In another way, though, Stephon Clark's death stands out. It's prompted California to consider changing the law around police shootings by making it harder to legally justify the use of deadly force. That's what we'll explore in this series.
If something happens to your loved one, you want to know what happened, and you want the person responsible to be held accountable.
There's this feeling that we just roll up, we open our doors, and we start shooting people, and that's just not a reality.
Get used to this space, buddies, because I'm not going nowhere until you guys hear me, until you do something about it.
This issue is going to be the biggest fight.
I'm Laurel Rosenhall, and this is Force of Law, a podcast about police shootings and California's attempt to do something about them. This episode explains how the state got to this point in its debate over police accountability. I'm a reporter for CalMatters. For years, I've covered the state capitol in Sacramento. And before we get too deep into this story, I want to explain a couple things about politics in the State House. The police have a ton of political power. And at the same time, there's a lot of outrage over the killing of Stephon Clark. Those competing forces will shape how politicians determine whether this is the year California enacts the nation's toughest statewide standard for justifying lethal force. Two Democrats first proposed the idea in 2018, weeks after police killed Stephon Clark. Intense opposition prompted the legislature to set it aside.
One of the challenges is it was so strongly opposed by law enforcement.
That's Lizzie Buchan, a lobbyist for the American Civil Liberties Union, which pushed for the bill.
Every senator that we spoke to had police officers in their districts call them, chiefs in their district call them. And one of the challenges is the people who are most impacted by police violence are not as influential as police officers.
This is Brian Marvel, president of the Peace Officers Research Association of California, called PORAC. It's a federation of police unions from around the state that oppose the bill. On his podcast, Brian spoke to union members.
Fortunately, with the coalition and a lot of work and getting folks involved in the process, reaching out to their elected officials, AB 931 was fortunately held. This was a very detrimental bill for our occupation and our profession.
The federal government doesn't yet have reliable data on police shootings in the United States. The Washington Post has tallied about 1,000 of them in America each year since 2015. But mainstream interest in police shootings focused on a handful of major cases until technology changed everything.
Social media is so now deeply intertwined in our lives. It's hard to imagine a world where it doesn't exist. But I do think that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that social media was instrumental in organizing and also in shifting people's awareness very quickly.
This is Nikki Jones,
Associate Professor of African American Studies at UC Berkeley.
She studies the effects of police violence and the criminal justice system on Black communities. Nikki says that before police shot and killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri,
there wasn't as much pushback. I mean, certainly people in the neighborhoods were always pushing back, but we didn't see the same kind of movement, right, that we've seen now.
During the Ferguson protests, Black Lives Matter and similar movements erupted into the mainstream. Smartphones, social media, and police body cameras have made officer-involved shootings harder to ignore. Cell phone videos of police encounters were still a novelty in 2009 when police killed Oscar Grant at an Oakland rapid transit station. He'd been riding a train crowded with people celebrating New Year's Eve. Grant and another passenger got into a fight. Transit police officers pulled Grant and a few others off the train and sat them on the platform. Video shows them moving Grant to a position where he was lying on his belly. An officer reaches for his holster, then shoots Grant in the back. Later, he told investigators he meant to go for his taser, but accidentally grabbed his gun. Major street protests followed. Within days of the shooting, news coverage says, people were watching one witness video on YouTube 1,000 times an hour. That eyewitness footage compelled Grant's family to seek justice.
When I saw the video, I was just so struck with pain and anger and hurt. I knew it was something I had to do.
This is Cephas X. Johnson.
Spelled C as in Charlie, E as in Edward, P as in Paul.
Most people call him Uncle Bobby. He's Oscar Grant's uncle. I spoke with him at his house in San Jose, where Afrocentric art and posters of his nephew cover the living room walls. He's talking about his decision to start a national organization to support families affected by police violence and agitate for changes to the law.
Once we got through the funeral, I can remember sitting at home at my mother's house, and we was watching the community in outrage, protesting. I could see the rebellion taking place, and that helped me realize just how loved Oscar was. And it was because of that gave me some balance to comprehend on how I can become a part of getting justice for Oscar.
Oscar Grant's case is really unusual because prosecutors charged the officer who killed him with murder. After a high-profile trial, jurors convicted the transit officer, Johannes Messerly, of involuntary manslaughter, suggesting they believed he had mistaken his pistol for his taser and deserved a lesser charge. Messerly left prison after 11 months of a 2-year sentence. In most cases, prosecutors do not press criminal charges against officers who kill. They frequently refer to the legal justification for using force that the United States Supreme Court said in 1989 in the case Graham versus Connor. We'll talk more about that ruling in later episodes. For now, just remember this phrase: reasonable officer. Essentially, the Supreme Court ruled that any use of force by police has to be judged this way. What would a reasonable officer do in the same situation? Given what he or she perceives the moment an officer pulls the trigger, if a reasonable officer would shoot, then that justifies the shooting. Law enforcement officials see the reasonable standard as a critical legal protection they need to perform a dangerous job. Here's the president of the California Police Chiefs Association.
Our profession is very, I don't say misunderstood.
Ronald Lawrence is the chief of police in Citrus Heights, California.
The split-second, immediate decisions that our police officers make in a moment's notice, a fraction of seconds, can mean literally the matter of life and death.
I interviewed him shortly after a man killed a police officer in California's Central Valley during a routine traffic stop.
You want to talk about emotions? Here's a police officer doing his job, stopping a car, and gets murdered by an assailant. It's those split-second decisions that if we as a society handcuff our peacekeepers and prevent them from making necessary decisions in that moment, in that split-second moment, we're going to have big problems, and California will become unsafe.
This was the argument law enforcement made in 2018 when they successfully lobbied against the bill to set a tougher standard for use of force.
Corey Salzillo on behalf of the California State Sheriff's Association in opposition to the bill. We think this bill discourages proactive policing.
My name is David Mustagny. I am here on behalf of the California Peace Officers Association.
Jonathan Feldman with the California Police Chiefs Association.
San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department.
The Association for Los Angeles Deputy Sheriff.
We are in opposition of this bill.
In opposition. Regrettably in opposition.
Also in opposition.
Opponents of the bill said it would put officers' lives at risk because
under the new standard, an officer cannot use deadly force if there is any other reasonable alternative.
Randy Perry lobbies for California's law enforcement unions. He's got a lot of juice in Sacramento. Here he is testifying in the Capitol in 2018 against the bill to give California a tougher standard for use of force, to go beyond the reasonable officer standard set by the Supreme Court and make it easier to press criminal charges on police.
They would say you could have retreated. If someone can later identify any alternative the officer should have used, then the officer's actions are now unlawful under this bill. Waiting until all other options are exhausted will be deadly for officers and citizen victims.
Lobbying for the bill in Sacramento that day were civil rights activists and a surprising number of Californians whose loved ones have died at the hands of police.
My name is Teresa Smith. I'm the mother of Cesar Cruz, who was shot 15 times in the back by 5 police officers in Anaheim. And I'm here today supporting this bill instead of celebrating his birthday today.
I'm the mother of Anthony Nunez. He was murdered in front of our home.
Mother of Rafael and Luke Grenage.
The aunt of James De La Rosa.
The grandfather of Petey Perez.
My name is Lisa King.
Steve Rogers.
Taylor Jackson.
I represent the Black community of Sac State.
The League of Women Voters of California.
The Alliance for Boys and Men of Color.
Amnesty International and strong support.
Strong support.
Strong support.
We urge a strong support of AB 931.
An 8-year-old boy voiced his strong support, too.
My name is Josiah Antonio Guzman Lopez, and I support this bill, and I don't want anybody to grow up without a dad, like me.
The shooting death of Josiah's dad launched his mother into this kind of activism 5 years ago.
Hi.
Hi, Lori, Laurel,
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. This is Brian Howie.
Hi, Brian. Nice to meet you.
Recently, I visited her at home in San Jose.
My name is Lori Valdez, and I'm a mother of 6. And I've been thrown into this whirlwind of a life of, dealing with police accountability and transparency when they killed my son Josiah's father, Antonio.
Lori remembers Antonio Guzman Lopez as a loving father who enjoyed public television with his son.
Antonio would, he'd be watching TV right here, and Josiah would be laying, they'd watch Wild Kratts.
He made corn tortillas from scratch, she says, and cooked the best shrimp tacos.
He was like my strength, like my support person. He was there for me and the kids.
She says he was an undocumented immigrant from Mexico who didn't speak English and was afraid of the police. On the day of the shooting, Lori told me, Josiah had been sick, and she called Antonio.
So I spoke with him, and I said, hey, I need you to come over here. I said, don't go to work today because I need your help. I'm really tired. I need you to help with Mijo. And he says, okay, I won't go to work. Antonio never told me that his bike had gotten stolen.
Antonio usually rode his bike to Lori's from his sister's house, where he often stayed. That day, he walked.
Had he told me that, I would have insisted I pick him up.
Antonio took a shortcut and walked across the San Jose State University campus. At 10:55 that morning, a student called 911 to report strange behavior by a man near the student housing. We couldn't get a recording of the call, but a report by the district attorney describes it. It says the student saw a man stabbing the air with some sort of knife. The student told the operator that the knife looked like a 10-inch long saw blade and that the man was rolling around on the ground. He said, everybody's stopping to look at him because he's doing a bunch of crazy shit. Then he added, you don't want that guy walking around on campus. Officers found Antonio kneeling on a street right next to campus. Body cam footage from the incident shows that as the officers approached, he stood up, holding onto the blade.
Get on the floor! Put that on the floor!
Things escalated fast when Antonio didn't drop it.
Put her on the ground! Taser, taser, taser.
After the officer fires his taser, Antonio appears to run toward the officer, who calls out to his partner.
Shoot him! Shots fired!
And then I see on the news around 10:50 in the morning, there's been an officer involved shooting. They thought it was a student.
The reports didn't identify the victim. Lori kept waiting for Antonio. By the end of the day, she was frustrated that he'd never called or showed up.
I was like, well, maybe he went to work after all, or why isn't he calling? And I was getting like, dude, how come you're not calling me?
So Lori went to the store with her kids.
So it was like 7:30 in the evening when I get a text message
from Antonio's niece.
And she said, we just found out my tío Toño's been killed, that he got in a fight with a cop and they killed him. And I remember looking at it and I'm like, what? You know, because I started like crying, like silently, like, no, this can't be happening. And then I said, I think your papi's dead. They said the cops killed him.
The next day, Lori took her kids to the street where Antonio was shot.
There was a picture there and there was a bunch of candles. And I remember the look on my son's face when he saw his dad's picture on the floor. And I remember picking up his picture. And I told him, Papa, I said, this is the last place Daddy was alive. Now he's gone to heaven with Jesus. So you're not going to see him no more. This picture is the last time you're going to remember Daddy.
The Santa Clara District Attorney determined that the officers were justified in killing Antonio because the law allows anyone to use deadly force in self-defense when facing an imminent threat of death or injury. That saw blade he was holding made him an imminent threat. An autopsy reported methamphetamines in his system.
Now, I don't know whether to believe that either because, you know, these coroners, they work with the sheriff's department and stuff, because he knows not to come to my house with any kind of drugs.
The DA's report also describes the standard for police to use deadly force, the one set by the Supreme Court 30 years ago. It says the circumstances must be analyzed from the vantage of a reasonable officer on the scene, and that the Supreme Court's definition of what's reasonable is generous to the police when they face a potential danger. Prosecutors apply this justification to police shootings all over the country. It was the justification the Sacramento District Attorney gave when she explained to reporters why she would not press criminal charges against the officers who killed Stephon Clark.
We as prosecutors are guided by the U.S. Supreme Court law that deals with what we call use of force. The law requires that we decide or we judge the reasonableness of an officer's actions based upon the circumstances confronting them at that moment of time.
When District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert said this, she was an hour into her presentation detailing what happened the night Clark died. She had explained that the officers saw him standing in a shooting position in the backyard and that he had advanced several feet toward them. She said the officers saw a flash of light from his hands and thought it was a reflection off a gun or a muzzle flash. They thought Clark was about to shoot them. During the press conference, Schubert said the officers' comments after the shooting proved it. Their body cameras recorded that exchange.
I'm good. He was still pointing. Oh, shit. When I saw again, you all right, dude? Yeah, I'm all right. I don't think I'm hit or anything.
We must recognize that they are often forced to make split-second decisions. We must also recognize that they are under tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving circumstances. And we must understand that we cannot do it with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. We must address it at that moment in time that they were confronted.
Stephon Clark was carrying a cell phone, not a gun. The officers didn't discover that until he was dead. They also didn't know at the time of the shooting that he'd entered his own grandparents' backyard. But when Schubert says the circumstances confronting them at that moment of time, she means nothing the police learned later could factor into her legal analysis.
So when we look at all of these facts and circumstances, we look at all of it, everything. We ask our question that we started out with again. And that question is, was a crime committed? There's no question. that human being died. But when we look at the facts and the law and we follow our ethical responsibilities, the answer to that question is no. And as a result, we will not charge these officers with any criminal liability related to the shooting death and the use of force on Stephon Clark.
An earlier bill to change that standard in California to make it easier to charge cops who use deadly force with a crime failed because there weren't enough lawmakers in the state capitol who wanted to vote for it. Instead of forcing a vote on the issue, the leader of the state Senate, Democrat Tony Atkins, set it aside as the session wrapped up in August 2018. She promised to work with both sides toward a new version for the legislature to consider in 2019.
I want safety for police and citizens, and I want people to be able to trust, again, that law enforcement is there to support them, and I want effective guidelines and policies that kind of ensure and balance that in a way, to prevent deaths.
Over months, lobbyists from the American Civil Liberties Union and other organizations negotiated with lobbyists representing law enforcement. Both sides talked about getting together behind a compromise. Here's Chief Ron Lawrence in January 2019.
It is our hope that we will find a negotiated middle ground. I don't know that we'll get there. What we don't want is a win or lose situation where one side has to win and the other side loses.
And again, Lizzie Buchan from the ACLU.
If we could have a bill that contains our priorities and has the standards that we want to see and law enforcement's okay with it, that would be a great solution. We're not there yet.
Is this an area where compromise is possible?
Certainly, yeah. There are different ways to get at this issue. There are different ways to protect civilian life.
The ACLU sent Lori Valdez, Uncle Bobby, and others whose loved ones died in officer-involved shootings to meet with Atkins, the Senate leader, in San Diego. During a quick walk between a speaking engagement and her waiting car, I asked Atkins about her take on that meeting.
Well, how does it not impact you?
Yeah.
I mean, it does.
Okay.
It's a big piece of why you need to look at these policies. And by the same token, I also know families of police officers who've been killed in the line of duty. So I think there's got to be a neutral party that understands the issues and works to get those two goals done. And I believe we need to do it. We need to do it. We do have a problem in this country, in this state, and so we've got to make sure that we get something done on this issue.
Well, I hope we can continue having the conversation. Thank you. Thanks. Bye. When legislative leaders say they want to get something done, that means a new law is almost certain to pass. But exactly what law would it be? And would the cops and the families ever get behind the same bill? It seemed unlikely. Still, their talks continued behind closed doors. Inside the Capitol, I talked with staffers in Assemblywoman Shirley Weber's office. She's the Democrat from San Diego who carried the previous version of the bill, and I knew she was working on the new version. Here's Weber's spokesman, Joe Kosurik.
If there's any room for us to continue the conversations and come to, an amenable conclusion, then, I don't necessarily want to bring that up right now. But I don't want to bring that up in the press necessarily. Right. Because these are good faith negotiations. And so I don't want to throw something out there to just try to leverage it. So.
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, I will keep bugging you if I don't hear from you first.
I trust you will. I trust I will hear from you at some point.
Yeah. As the negotiations were underway in Sacramento, Lori was trying to get university officials in San Jose to show her the body camera footage of Antonio's death. The 5th anniversary of the shooting was coming up, and she put in a public records request for the video.
Hello?
Hi, Lori. This is Laurel Rosenhall at CalMatters.
Hi, Laurel. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm just like, I don't have a lot of anxiety.
Yeah.
I have a lot of anxiety and just feelings that I'm going through.
Lori had emailed me that day saying she'd found out the university would let her see the video in a few weeks.
It was like something I wanted, but then now the fear was real because now I'm going to see things that it's going to be for the first time, you know, so it's going to be like if Antonio just got killed. The day I see everything, you know, and it's really affecting me, you know.
I asked her how things were going with the bill. She sounded weary.
I wish the officers who caused this would be able to switch with me and feel every bit of emotion I have, you know. Everything I'm doing, I'm not doing it out of revenge or trying to hurt anybody. I'm trying to fix what's broken because it hurts and it's impacted my family in such a negative way. My son is suffering that I don't want other kids to have to suffer like this.
It became clear pretty soon that the sides hadn't reached a compromise. Law enforcement groups convened a telephone press conference to announce their own bill.
Hi, everyone. This is Jonathan Munoz of the California Police Chiefs Association. We're going to get started here shortly.
In politics, the best defense is a good offense.
Law enforcement throughout the state has been working for the past 6 months to develop this series of comprehensive changes designed to reduce the incidents where officers are threatened or are responding to serious threats to citizens.
The following day, Assemblywoman Weber unveiled her bill with Uncle Bobby and Lori Valdez by her side.
Good morning to everyone, and I want to thank all of you for coming to this press conference today. We're here to announce the introduction of AB 392, which is the California Act to Save Lives.
Both bills address police use of force, but in very different ways. Weber's bill, like her previous version, would set a tougher standard for justifying force, going beyond the reasonable officer standard set by the U.S. Supreme Court and making it easier to charge police with crimes.
AB 392 will authorize officers to use deadly force only when it is necessary to prevent imminent and serious bodily injury or death. This means that they may use force only if there is no reasonable alternative, including warnings, verbal persuasion, or other non-lethal methods of resolution or de-escalation.
Current police accountability laws do not work.
Assemblyman Kevin McCarty of Sacramento wrote the bill with Weber.
99% of the time, we know law enforcement officers do not cross the line with regards to excessive force. But when the 1% happens, we all deserve accountability. And under current law, police accountability rarely happens.
Law enforcement groups see their bill as a way to reduce police shootings and protect police from unjust prosecution.
What they're trying to do is they want cops to go to jail for doing their job.
Again, Brian Marvel with the Police Officers Union.
How can we take a look at use of force in the state of California, try to minimize deadly force? So we're taking a more holistic approach on how we handle that.
The cops have settled on a new strategy this round. Rather than only fighting against something the way they did the first time, they've crafted a plan they will fight for. Their bill would give officers more training on use of force rules and require police departments to adopt policies that spell out de-escalation tactics and alternatives to deadly force. Brian says California police need money for new training on how to deal with homelessness and substance abuse, instead of bills that would hinder them from doing their jobs.
We've been given no resources. We've been given no training on that. We're very minimal. So what we're trying to do is let's bring these professionals in. Let's get them to support what we're doing and how we're functioning. But also let's help them out to maybe where they can be the primary responder instead of law enforcement all the time.
One more thing the law enforcement bill does puts it in direct conflict with Weber's bill. It locks the reasonable officer standard from the U.S. Supreme Court into California state law. Police organizations persuaded a state senator to carry their bill, Ana Caballero, of Salinas.
I really think that there's an opportunity here to change how we police in the state of California, and it's much needed. And to have them at the table is really important.
Why is it important to have them at the table?
The best results come about when people that disagree with each other sit down at the table and work it out.
This senator is excited about her bill to improve officer training. She also sees it as an opportunity to keep the negotiations alive, to try to get the activists and the police somehow to agree. For now, though, after months of negotiations behind the scenes, here is where things stand. 2 Democrats, 2 bills, 2 vastly different approaches to curbing police violence. One would give California the nation's toughest statewide standard for justifying deadly force. The other would solidify the national standard and bolster police use of force policies and training. On the next episode of Force of Law, we'll explain these different approaches and try to assess what each could do. As the series continues, we'll examine how this fight plays out in California's capital, where politicians will confront dueling influences, the status and campaign money of law enforcement versus the raw emotions of Californians who feel the powerful have wronged them. Democrats hold 3/4 of the legislative seats, along with the governor's office. Their decisions on police accountability may reveal fault lines in California's one-party rule and challenge the state's progressive image. You're listening to Force of Law, a production of CalMatters and Studiotobe. I'm your host, Laurel Rosenhall. Brian Howie produced this episode. Cheryl Duvall is our editor. Catherine Ray Mondo is our audio engineer. David Lesher of CalMatters and Joaquin Alvarado and Kristen Belden of Studiotobe are the executive producers. Thanks also to KR Nava, Chloe Behrens, and Capital Public Radio in Sacramento.